Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this last event of the season at Bruegel. Before the Brussels goes quieter for the summer holidays. It's really good to finish this season on the issue of nature restoration. This is an issue not just for economists at Bruegel, but really for a wide variety of sectors and people concerned with policy in many different areas. And with the new paper that we've just published on how to implement the nature restoration law, we've aimed to look at a range of different issues with regard to restoration of ecosystems, but particularly what are the different cost pathways that it's possible for member states to follow. I'm Heather Graby, Senior Fellow here at Bruegel, and I'm really delighted to present this paper today with one of the co-authors, Camille Meelbaum from the Dutch National Bank. One of the other co-authors is in the audience. It's been a really good collaboration with the Dutch National Bank. And we also have two excellent panelists to discuss the issue. We have Friederike Erxleben of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment. Now the name's just changed. Environment, nuclear, and there's something else as well. Climate. Here it is. Oh yes, well, climate, indeed. The Federal Ministry for the Environment, Climate Action, Nature Conservation, and Nuclear Safety. There you go. Get all of the words lined up. And we also have Dirk Schoonmaker, who's a non-resident fellow at Bruegel and also professor at the University of Rotterdam. So it's a really great panel of experts to talk about this issue. So we're going to talk about different ways that member states could implement the nature restoration law. The law itself gives quite a few different options for member states. And the reason why it's important to look at the cost issue is because governments' budgets are cash strapped, but also because doing it on the cheap could lead to bigger costs later. Essentially, the loss of ecosystem services, which is what happens when nature is degraded and when restoration doesn't happen. It's extremely expensive to try to replace ecosystem services with human technology. And many of those services actually can't be replaced with human technology. If you think about the cost of doing pollination of flowers by hand to ensure a crop, that's just one example of how expensive it can be. Likewise, trying to replace water supply. And of course, there are plenty of other things, especially DNA in biodiversity and other ecosystem services that are impossible to replace. And there's one cost of inaction, is that it's is about 1.7 billion euros. Now, the EU is a wealthy continent, but nevertheless, 81% of our habitats are in poor condition, which makes it harder and harder for them to keep providing clean water, filtering the air, providing soil fertility, which is essential for crops to grow, and also pollination. And the critical issue of carbon sequestration and storage. And in recognition of that 81% of EU habitats that are in poor condition, the nature restoration law sets targets for member states to restore a degraded nature, and Camille will come onto that, how that happens. But just to give you a sense of the scale of the funding needs, the current estimates of the annual cost of restoration across the 27 member states is 8.2 billion. And we know that the available biodiversity funding under the current EU budget would only cover a small part of that sum. The Commission is about to produce its proposals for the next multi-annual financial framework, and that the proportion of that money for biodiversity, dedicated for biodiversity, may in fact decrease. So clearly national funding is going to be needed to take the primary burden to meet the targets under the nature restoration law. And that means member states face difficult choices. They face trade-offs between this kind of spending and other kind of spending, but also what to prioritize. What should they focus on where budgets are constrained? So I'm going to hand over now to Camille so that she can present the different pathways, and then we will go into a discussion.
Yeah, Heather, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting us to present this paper that you also co-authored with us. But also thank you to everybody for turning out to discuss this important topic. In this analysis, we aim to set out the implications of 3 different pathways of the implementation of the nature restoration law. Of course, the pathways that are possible are much larger than the ones that we line out, but these are 3 examples that we think provides an interesting context and maybe give some illustrate the possible benefits as well as cost, as Heather mentioned, to these pathways that members take. And importantly, we focus on 3 key milestones within the nature restoration law, which is a subset of the targets within the nature restoration law, but we focus on the restoration of degraded ecosystems and specifically Annex 1 habitats and excluding marine systems. And we focus on the milestones in 2030, where member states should have started 30% of restoration measures in 30% of degraded ecosystem within their country. This does not mean that these ecosystems should be restored by them, but the measures should have started. The restoration will probably take much longer, probably decades and even maybe centuries, depending on the ecosystem and the amount of degradation. Following the 2030 target, there's the 2040 target, where the area that needs to be covered by the restoration measures is doubled. And finally, by 2050, 90% of the degraded areas should be covered by restoration measures by these member states. These targets are binding on the member state level, but there's some leeway for member states to implement these targets. And as I said, we explored 3 different options. One is where member states choose to restore all ecosystems equally in relation to the share of degradation of those ecosystems. And this is done for all the member states at the same time. They all choose the same strategy, let's say. They do give priority to Natura 2000 sites because they are deemed to be more vulnerable or more more important. Then secondly, we look at a pathway where member states decide to restore ecosystems to minimize restoration cost, which if you look at fiscal budget size is one of the possible options that member states might take. And finally, importantly, we also look at an option where member states decide to maximize climate mitigation benefits, such that ecosystems are chosen deciding on their climate mitigation potential and their added carbon sequestration coming from from restoration. And we do this using public data. We use data on the area of degraded Annex 1 habitats for member states. It's available on a member state level. It's publicly available data, and it's self-reported, so the quality is not as good for each member state, which is one of the reasons why we decided to exclude, for instance, Romania, because the area included by them was larger than the actual area of their country. So we did some data quality checks to ensure that there was a decent level of quality, but it's self-reported data. It's always good to mention because there could be some mismatches within that. We also exclude marine ecosystems, as I said. And then additionally, we have carbon uptake potential of these different ecosystems resulting from restoration. Finally, we use different restoration sizes for different restoration projects, and we have the costs of restoration of different ecosystems, and we let this vary by country. Well, using this publicly available data, we combine this in one big data set, and we are able to create a synthetic range of restoration projects for each ecosystem in each member state. And then we assign restoration costs, which vary within the range of restoration costs that are possible, and we also allow for cost differences between countries, to allow, for instance, for cost differences resulting for labor, material, land, etc. And then for each year, for each member state, we select the projects that need to be restored by that year or need to be have started restoration measures such that the underlying targets of 2030, 2040, and 2050 are met. And importantly to mention is that we just decided to focus on one of the many benefits of nature restoration within this analysis for data quality purposes, and just because the quality of carbon mitigation data is much better than the other ecosystem services, it's important to mention that obviously the benefits of ecosystem services are much greater than just the carbon mitigation potential, but because the analysis allowed us only to include this, it's always good to mention, but even showing the carbon mitigation benefits are also very large, which you will see in the slides before this. And first we'll talk about the pain of the nature restoration law, which is the cost, as had already mentioned. And in the graph that you see 3 different lines. The yellow line is the first pathway where member states decide to restore all ecosystems equally. Then the green line is where they decide to minimize costs. And finally, the blue line is where they decide to maximize the carbon potential. And you see, especially in the beginning, that these cost differences vary a lot. This makes sense because as member states come closer to the 2030 and 2040 deadlines, there's still some leeway in choosing which restoration projects to undertake. But as soon as they come closer to the final deadline of 2050, there's not many options left, right? They come close to the 90% coverage ratio. And in that sense, we also see those cost lines converge over time. So the most differences that we see are especially in the beginning, right after the start of the implementation of the nature restoration law. And these cost differences are quite large. So if we look at the cost minimization pathway compared to the all ecosystems evenly, we can see a cost decrease in the first 5 years of roughly 80%. But as I said, this cost difference will decrease over time as member states have less and less restoration projects to choose from. If we look at maximizing climate benefits, where they look at carbon uptake potential of different restoration projects and different ecosystems, we see actually that this costs more, especially in the beginning, relatively to the all ecosystems evenly. This is, of course, an important thing to take into account for fiscal reasons for member states, but it shouldn't necessarily be the only one. And importantly, the carbon benefits also vary quite large between these 3 different pathways. For instance, if we look at the maximum sequestration pathway, we see that up until 2050, there's roughly 1,100 million tons of carbon sequestration of the total area that's restored. That's quite a lot. It's almost 9 times emissions of the Netherlands. And these differences between pathways are especially high in the beginning. And they do converge over time for the reason that I just explained. As further into the restoration of and in the implementation, there's just less projects to choose from. And we see that in the beginning, the maximum sequestration pathway, so the maximizing the climate benefits, is roughly double in the first 5 years compared to the even ecosystem restoration pathway. This decreases to roughly 1/3 by 2040. But importantly, when we look at climate mitigation benefits, the early sequestration matters more because every ton in carbon in the air, it adds to the climate change. And so, especially within this pathway, we really should look at the benefits in the beginning and not necessarily in 50 years. Finally, we also look at the differences in ecosystems that are restored between these different pathways. Obviously, in an even spread, you see that member states choose to restore ecosystems proportionally to their share of degraded nature within their country. So we see an even share from 2030 to 2050. However, if we look at the cheaper potential, so the cost minimization pathway, we see that they select relatively cheap agricultural projects first and leave forest and freshwater ecosystems to be restored later on, while actually those provide the most climate benefits, as we can see in the bottom 3 bars of the graph on the right. Again, we see that all pathways converge as member states have less and less ecosystems to choose from, and they almost reach that 90% goal in 2050. We do see a large variation in project costs within ecosystems as well. So it doesn't always differ between ecosystems, but also within ecosystems you have different habitat types. But even within habitat types, so for instance you have a very specific type of forest, restoring that in one spot can be much more expensive than in another spot, even related to the level of degradation or the location. So it's important to note that these differences come from differences between ecosystems, but also very much within ecosystems. And finally, if we all are to restore nature, it's very important who owns the nature that we are to restore. And actually, we also looked at land ownership data in Europe. It's quite hard, we found out. We had to do a lot of literature reviews, read different reports from different institutions. But what we found out is that in Europe, most of nature is actually owned privately. So it could be harder. At least the incentives should be different and should be taken into account when you make policy to implement the nature restoration law. We saw, for instance, that in some countries like France and Germany, a large share of the nature is actually in hands of large landholders. So in France, we saw that roughly 3/4 of forest is privately owned, with banks among the largest landowners. But also in Germany, we saw that foresters own roughly 1/3 of land, and private individuals are also very important in owning nature. The country where I am from, the Netherlands, is actually one of the exceptions. And we see this illustrates the large differences between member states and also perhaps the implications for policy, because these should be taken into account. But in the Netherlands, almost all, let's say roughly 4/5 of all nature is actually owned by public entities. And when a country decides to make a strategy to implement a nature restoration law, it could be very different if they own the land themselves to restore it than when the nature is owned either by private individuals or companies. So that's an important difference to take into account. So finally, to include, and let's start the panel in a bit, it's important to know that there is flexibility for national governments in reaching these different targets, and this flexibility matters for the outcomes. If they choose lowest cost, they might choose the cheaper, it might be fiscally beneficial for them, but the cost might also be larger in terms of carbon mitigation potential, but also in terms of other ecosystem services that we were not able to illustrate with this data analysis, but they are definitely there, and also is shown by the impact assessment of the nature restoration law. Priority to carbon sequestration might come at a cost at first, but the benefits accrue over time and are especially relevant in the context of climate change. Also, the carbon benefits keep growing over the century, and they become larger over time. And finally, importantly, all these pathways converge in time with all these different benefits. So the choices that we make in the beginning are very important, but in the end, they all go towards the same path. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Camille. I hope that was really clear. A lot of really interesting data there, and you're welcome to look at the paper online. It's on the Bruegel website. You can also start thinking about what questions you might want to ask about the paper. In the room, I will take questions directly from the audience, but if you're listening to us online, then you can go to Slido and you can put up a question or a comment with the hashtag restoration. So I'm sure you all know how to use Slido by now. And then I will bring in your questions into the debate. So I now want to turn to Friederike Erxleben, who at the German Federal Ministry for Environment, Climate Action and Nuclear Safety, and Nature Protection. It's now, I think it's an acronym of 5 letters now, the ministry, but yeah. Yes. How does this look from the national perspective? We've had some very interesting overall data. We've also looked at land ownership in Germany, where you've got a large number of small landowners owning 1/3 of the forest and another nearly 1/4 of private individuals owning forest. How does this match the intention of the German government to approach the question, especially in these critical early years when budgets are constrained, but when the benefits of doing nature restoration are so much greater?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here and for being included in this panel, and thank you for putting forward this study, which is very interesting for us. And in Germany, even before the nature restoration law was implemented, we put forward the Federal Action Plan on nature-based solutions for climate and also for biodiversity. So we recognized the potential of combining those two targets and obligations that are now combined under the LULUCF regulation, as well as the Nature Protective NRL, Nature Restoration Law. And we have 69 different measures already in place that combine these two areas. We recognize that ecosystem restoration has a very big impact on climate as well. And I would like to highlight one specific point for Germany. We do have a lot of drained peatlands. And with regard to your study, you focused on the climate impact that is created by sequestering additional carbon within the ecosystems. But for us, peatlands emit a lot of carbon dioxide, around about 54 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year. So we are looking at these habitat types that are situated in peatlands and seeing the benefits of moving forward with these as fast as possible. But that said, you have highlighted that we have in Germany a situation where a lot of land is privately owned. We have also another situation that makes nature restoration planning a bit more challenging than in other member states. We are a federally organized state, which means that most of the competences regarding nature protection is actually in the hands of the states. So they are the ones in the end that will choose the habitat types and areas of restoration where they want to move forward. On a federal level, we provide subsidies and kind of the framework for what we want to incentivize private landowners to move forward to. And also, we do see the need of financing on EU level. I think we will come to this later, because we now have the situation, for example, regarding with the CAP, that we don't have a vision for the same time frame we are supposed to provide financial data within the restoration plans. So within the restoration plans, we have to look far in the future, and with specific financing issues from EU level, we do not have the same far along vision.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. And I think we will come back a bit later to this question of the division of competences. Always an issue we discuss in Brussels constantly, but it's there at national level as well. And it's tricky because in some member states, for example, it's local authorities who are responsible. So you've got the land ownership question, but then also these very different structures.
Thank you for highlighting that. I do not want to leave out our local authorities as well, because they are really important. And when you stated what amount of forest is owned by the state, a lot of forests are owned by local communities. So this is also a different level of state ownership than it is with the states or the federal government.
Yes. Kenny, you wanted to come back on that?
Yeah, just maybe to the peat, because we very much recognize, I think we have the same issue in the Netherlands with peat being a specific habitat type that's not included in Annex 1 habitats, but which is especially important in terms of climate change mitigation. And we had one extension, which didn't end up in the paper, where we also included restoring peat ecosystems just because of their climate potential benefits. It didn't end up in the paper just because it didn't relate to the targets in the same way, but we very much do recognize that it's very important, yeah.
Yeah, peatlands are vital. So in thinking about all of this, a really big issue comes up, Dirk, as regards who should pay for it and how to pay for it. So there's the question of how much will it cost and what to choose at the federal level or at the national government level. But there are also all kinds of other issues involved. And we have an interesting temporal issue right now that the nature restoration law, the member states are now preparing their national plans, and at the same time this week the Commission has come out with a new proposal for a roadmap towards nature credits to bring in some private finance, and it's coming out with a new proposal for the next multi-annual financial framework, which will be putting a heavy emphasis on more spending on defence and other priorities. So I can just imagine how tempting it must be when you're sitting in a ministry in a national capital thinking, how am I going to find the money to do all of this? To say, I know, the markets will take care of this. Why don't we just sell lots of private credits in these ecosystems, and then money will come flowing in, and that will take all the pressure off our budget. How realistic is that kind of thinking, Dirk?
Yeah. Thank you, and thanks for the presentation. I would like to take the question in two parts. On the first part, on the modeling itself, given that at the macro level we still work with models where economic growth is the goal, and then whether we talk about nature, whether we talk about other issues, social and environmental issues, which we do for society, they're always presented as a cost. So you automatically end up, if you ask I worked at the Ministry of Finance, so they do the budget, so you always end up with the low cost approach. And I think you started off, Heather, when we started the seminar, that there are trade-offs. And I think that's where we really should start. We have economic goals, but we have social goals, and we have environmental goals. And now we are going to include this one of nature restoration, and we have already climate change. And then if you have that kind of model, and one type of models is Wise Horizon, my colleague Rutger Hoekstra is developing them here also in Brussels, where you do well-being, inclusive, social economy. So you include all three goals, and then you can really come to different solutions. Then you come closer probably to your carbon maximization automatically, because that will be a goal in your model. So I think the macroeconomic modeling, the way it happens today, you get automatically to the lowest cost solution, because nobody wants to spend physical space too much. So I would say number one is we need a new type of economic models to make better choices and have a better handle on the trade-offs. And there are trade-offs, because in the end you can only spend money once. So you have to make public choices for society, and that's what we call the budget process in Parliament. And then the second issue is our markets going to help out? You probably all know a little bit about the market for carbon credits. And we also know what is the ETS price, is about 70 euros at the moment, I think. And most carbon credits are trading at 5, 10 or 15 euros or 2 euros. So that means they are not real. You don't have to be an economist to understand if your carbon credit is 5 euros and the real price in the market is 70 euros, they are bogus. So the carbon credit market is really very unreliable. And I would really hope that we're not going to make the same system. So the ETS is fine, because that's hard, and the production facilities have to reduce. They need permits to emit carbon, and otherwise they have to buy them. So that's for real. But all these credit markets, economists love them, because it should be flexible, tradable, and the whole world is tradable in the world of economists. In the real world, we see a lot of escapes. Hey, you are flying, you buy some carbon offsets at 5 euros a ton. So you're not really offsetting it. So, and I would really warn, don't do that. Don't rely on that. Because if we want to restore nature, which is a public good, then that's a choice in Parliament to make, and then use public spending. And that is reality. So if we want to do this, then put your money where your mouth is, but that's the public money. And at the same time, if you look at the graphs, at the low-cost approach, in the early years it will be a low price. So a lot is backloaded, because the expensive projects come later. And then if at the end of the day not much is coming forward, then nothing happened at all. So it is really dangerous to follow only the cost path, but look at your nature goals. How do you want to achieve them? To really get it going. And this idea that markets are going to help out, because you need a business model. That's where private parties come in, like with not carbon offsets, but really when you need a carbon permit to emit carbon, then then you can make a business model of it. Then it's fine. But here, far less. And in the end, there's not much to return to get. And then you can say, then we force people to reduce their nature impact. But why not do that straight away?
More cheaper and more effective to do that. Did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think we largely agree, especially on the voluntary side of carbon credits, and also what we see. The ETS, we very much agree. It's a great system. It also needed some iterations before it was actually functional. But at this, we've reached this stage where it's functional, and we're looking at, as long as the targets are hard, it will work. Nature is indeed a harder pill to swallow in that sense. We've also, in a different version, earlier version of this paper, we've also sort of thought of a way to implement the ETS within nature restoration based on carbon credits, where, for instance, landowners or large landowners would get sort of a norm, and based on their carbon restoration potential and the potential carbon uptake of their ecosystem. And within that system, which would be EU-wide, they could trade those carbon benefits, because those are quite, if you compare them to other ecosystem services, they're relatively easy to measure. The quality is quite high. So that's one of the pathways that we sort of internally thought about. How would you think, could that work?
There is a huge transaction cost and enforcement cost to really make it work. An easier way is that you would do the same. So you set the norms, and then it makes no difference whether you have public or private ownership. So you set the norm, what you want to achieve. And then, so even the state forestry in the Netherlands, they are state owned, but still, if they maintain the forest, they get an annual subsidy from the local authorities who have nature targets, so they get paid to maintain nature. So I would argue, yes, set the norms, and then it makes no difference whether it's a local authority, a private landowner, private forest owner, or a public authority. You set the norm, and then you make money available at cost price that they can maintain at this minimum norm. And then the difference between public and private ownership does not matter, because the government is just paying what is needed, nothing more, but is needed to do the job.
Yeah, but at a time where budgets are, let's say, constrained, and maybe nature is not necessarily the most promising direction where public money is going in at least we're looking at it's becoming harder and harder to free up money. So perhaps you need a sort of a carrot and a stick system where you...
Yeah, but then you put a minimum norm, and if you don't obey the norm, then you get the stick, a penalty. And let me give a nice example, which has been the most effective thing, real estate. We know 1/3 of emissions is from real estate. And in the Netherlands, for commercial real estate, so offices and like here, it needs to be not worse than label C. So you have A, B, C till G. So the worst labels are forbidden.
You mean for energy efficiency?
For energy, sorry. Thanks
for energy efficiency.
Energy efficiency, so you need to be at least label C. They just implemented the law, and I think it escaped lobbying at the time, so it came into law. And it has been the most cost-effective way to get there, because then private parties had to do it themselves. And now they are at label C, commercial real estate. And I would argue, given that nature is a public good, so let's put some subsidy in for the ones who are helping out, but then punishing them with real fines if they don't do it. And that's what you can call it then a credit, but just give them punishment.
How does that sound to you, Friederike? I mean, I'm not asking you to make federal government policy on the spot, but does that kind of norm setting and standard setting, is that enough of an incentive, given that the various parties who could be funding the nature restoration have very different financial heft. Some have much bigger budgets than others. For example, as you were saying, a lot of forest is owned by local communities, which really may not have that much money. And this is not just funding for restoring nature in the sense of planting indigenous trees. It's also opportunity cost money, essentially. It's paying for maintaining land as forest rather than converting it into agriculture or a housing estate or commercial real estate. And the opportunity cost might actually be rather high for doing that. Now, you can do that by simply saying this is a national park or this is a protected area, but sometimes you also need to do that by paying the opportunity cost, especially, of course, in the Global South. We're mainly talking about Europe now, but that's the biggest issue. Do you think that the norm setting, standard setting, is enough of a framework?
Well, this is a quite hard question to answer. Since we are trying to work together with the land owners and the rights holders, since they are the people most affected both by the negative effects of degrading ecosystems, for example, by climate change, but also by the challenges, as you have just said, and the costs of maintaining and restoring ecosystems. So that is something we bear in mind, and we are also therefore focusing with our federal action plan on providing subsidies as incentives to move forward. Mm-hmm. However, we see the necessity to really strengthen our efforts to reach the goals set out by the nature restoration law. And we would also like to highlight that for us, restoring nature and land use, productive land use and economic land use are not mutually exclusive. Yeah, and we see that a lot of foresters and farmers know what they are doing with their lands because they need to maintain their land in a way that it is profitable and economical, usable for a sustainable amount of time. And we want to enable them to act in the best interest of their land in order to facilitate and promote nature restoration. And I would also like to highlight that when we are looking at the costs, for example, the high cost pathway focusing on mitigation, climate change, we are not only putting those euros in fulfilling the obligation under the nature restoration law, we are putting those euros in fulfilling our obligation under the LULUCF regulation, and furthermore to all the co-benefits or all the goals that we have heard before, social, health issues, water resilience, and all these questions are addressed with those euros. So it is really important to stress that we are not focusing with the nature restoration law on some kind of funny side project that can only be done when everything else is secure and in the basket. No, this is, and I think also the commissioner herself said it like that, this is a strategic important issue for Europe to have resilient ecosystems, because our prosperity, even within the frame of looking at the highest GDP, looking for constant growth, our ecosystems are the basis not only for our health as human beings, but also for the prosperity of our economic systems.
Yeah. Can I pick up on one issue where the private sector can help out and is helping out? So there is also some good news. Because you nicely said the forest and land in the best use for themselves, but also what we see happening, for example, in the Netherlands, we have a big insurance company who's the biggest private landowner. They are leasing a lot of land, and they measure soil quality, and they give a discount on the lease to the farmers if they do nature inclusive farming, because they argue the value of the land is maintained because of the better farming. So the value is maintained, that's for the owner. And then the farmer gets a lower lease, so he earns back the money. And the same with bank loans. Many farmers get bank loans. They start to get lower interest rates, a lower risk premium, if they do nature-inclusive farming. So in that way, that's a nice way where the private sector can help out, where it is a win-win. Because it reduces risk for the financial sector, and it incentivizes the farmers or the landowners.
Yes, there are two very fundamental issues here that perhaps it's worth just highlighting. One is about costs now and costs later.
Yeah.
And the other one is about risk versus profit. So on costs now, costs later, in standard public finance models and in most economic models, as you said at the beginning, Dirk, nature is seen as a cost. It's a nice to have. It's quite low in the Maslowian hierarchy.
Yeah.
You worry about it when, at the weekend, essentially. But in fact, the problem is that with 81% of habitats degraded in the EU, we are reaching the level where nature can no longer regenerate water flow through the rivers. We're having real problems with droughts and floods, pollination services, which really affects our capacity to grow food, soil quality, huge problem. And of course, that then causes problems with, for example, soil runoff into waterways, and then that pollutes rivers and the sea, and we get problems with the marine ecosystem, which means then, fishing is affected and so on. So the economic impact of losing nature is now becoming really large, even in Europe, where we can replace some of this with human technology. It's even bigger in the global south. So what we are facing is, if we don't restore nature, enormous costs later on in trying to do it after much more severe degradation has happened and after nature loses the capacity to regenerate an ecosystem. But the other issue is about, especially the nature credits debate, so much of it is about profit models.
But can we still stay on the models, Heather? Because there is here an important lesson from the Nordhaus Nick Stern debate. Mm-hmm. I remember Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize, and he had an integrated assessment model where everything was modeled away. And his main conclusion was, when it gets 2050, we start to reduce carbon emissions because of the high discount rate. So his model was a way of not starting climate mitigation. And Nick Stern said, we need a credible real-world shadow price, and we should start getting today, and we should use a low social discount rate. And I think I side with Nick Stern, and he argued that economists with their assessment models and the GDP modeling made the issues disappear, and so there was no action taken. Well, you are also arguing, the way you were asking, that we should get starting today, 81%. So try to forget about effects on GDP because the issue disappears. Well, we all know as citizens, we need to start acting today and spend public money on it if we want to restore it.
Yeah, this is what Mark Carney called the tragedy of the horizon when he was governor of the Bank of England. He's now Prime Minister of Canada, so I hope he's going to implement this view. But this view that essentially by the time you can see and feel climate impacts, such as, for example, heat waves and floods, it's already too late to really have a significant impact. Now, we're already seeing many of those effects of climate, and it's nature, as Friederike said earlier, that provides the resilience, which actually holds the soil and stops it from causing deadly mudslides. It's actually the floodplains, natural floodplains, peatlands, for example, that absorb the excess water as well as the carbon, which actually allow us to do that. And of course, trees providing shade, both for crops and indeed in cities. So these essential services are fundamental. But the other thing that's just come out of this discussion is about the risk side. So nature credits, I think you can't assume that they will be a profit-making instrument. And in fact, we just have a paper out at Bruegel today, it's on the website, about nature markets. How far can they provide additional durable finance? They can provide, certainly there's some promise there, and we set out some key principles principles to make nature markets work properly, an intriguing new idea about nature shares. But fundamentally, they are a risk management instrument. They're a way of holding nature-positive assets in a financial portfolio, or if you're an insurance company, in order to hedge against the future risks of nature degradation, which will vastly devalue your other assets. So that's another way of thinking about it. But I don't want to get too distracted into nature credits because we're all very fascinated by this idea. I want to come to questions in the room and also questions online. So we have two interesting questions online. One is a rather technical one for Camille on how realistic is sequestration in the modelling that you've done, you personally have done in particular. Are the plans science-based? So could you just tell us about the science basis of the pathways?
Yeah, sure. So what we did with the carbon sequestration modeling is we used data also used by the impact assessments, where they have based on the habitat level, so that's a bit more detailed than the ecosystem level, the carbon uptake potential, the annual sequestration rates per hectare, as well as the maximum available stock. And what we did is, from literature, we took estimates to what extent different ecosystems already can sequester carbon in, like, let's say, degraded state compared to when they are restored. Then we use data on the average restoration period per ecosystem, and then we applied this to these different ecosystem levels on a habitat level. It's quite technical, sorry, but it's also written down all in the paper. But then what you get is you get sort of carbon sequestration rates on an annual basis in a degraded state compared to a restoration state and a restored state, and there's a stock that it all adds up to, and when it's capped at the stock. So it's very much science-based. We used estimates from science, and we also allow for the carbon sequestration to differ in a degraded state compared to these other states. And finally, it's good to mention that we only we show the added carbon sequestration as a result from restoration. So even degraded ecosystems already sequester a minimum amount of carbon, but this is only the added carbon sequestration resulting from restoration.
And for further details, you can read our paper up on the Bruegel website. So I'm going to go to the other question online, start getting your questions ready in the room. The question is actually quite interesting about farmers on marginal land. So we know that farmers on marginal land tend to have quite poor incomes because often their soil is not great quality and so on. And typically they receive agricultural subsidies that may become less under the new Common Agricultural Policy budget. So where is it likely and when is it likely that nature restoration money could become a viable income for farmers on poor land, encouraging them to transition into land managers? So this would be things like rewilding projects. We have examples of that. For example, in the Netherlands, of course, I think there was one of the biggest rewilding projects back 20 years ago began. Is that something that could be done through the nature restoration law implementation?
Well, thank you for this question. I think the term nature restoration money is quite interesting, since so far we do not have a nature restoration money fund or something like that on EU level or on national level. We have, however, as it is stated in the question, the CAP, and the CAP also has the possibility within its pillars and its different programs to finance eco-schemes and a more, a management system that is more consistent with nature restoration than it is with traditional farming, focusing on the most output. So I do see that within the CAP there are possibilities, especially if the new CAP under the new MFF will allow for that and will foresee for that. But of course, the focus on having land managers or the understanding of being a steward for the land is quite important. And with regard, again, to peatlands, we have the idea of being a climate farmer for rewetted peatlands in paludiculture systems. So this is something we are certainly going to look into, And we are also trying to find this nature restoration money within different pots of money that are available and that we need to dedicate or earmark for nature restoration.
I fully endorse that, because that is really interesting, because you move away from financing output, and I think we have enough food worldwide, so there's no need to finance that anymore, more output, and that we rebrand the money, but we're basically updating the policy goal, that we use that money for nature conservation, restoration, and I think that's a very promising way of doing it, because we need to help the farmers if we want to and the forest owners, if we want to have a change. If we go on holidays in Austria, Switzerland, it's quite clear that these farmers don't earn all the money from the milk. So they are used to this scheme, and then everybody enjoys it for tourism, but also for nature benefits. And I think that's the way forward.
Well, also the fact that intensive agriculture depletes the capacity of the land to produce over time. It works really well for a few decades, but then the soil can no longer keep producing.
That's the key thing, that at the moment we have more harmful subsidies, like maximizing output, than whatever we need for restoration. So stopping the subsidies, the story is exactly the same as fossil. Stopping the fossil subsidies is 10 times more important than the new money for renewables.
Indeed. I mean, the Global Biodiversity Framework recognizes that globally, nature-harming subsidies amount for about $500 billion a year, and the positive money for biodiversity needs to be 200 billion, and we're still far away from even reaching that. I think that the total amount pledged at the last Biodiversity Summit was less than 200 million, let alone 200 billion. And even in the EU, I think it's something like 48 billion a year is spent on harmful subsidies, and there's a very good Worldwide Fund for Nature report on the harmful subsidies under the CAP in particular. So, I mean, one interesting question is whether it's possible simply to shift from national EU budgets and the EU budget and from national budgets nature-harming subsidies that would already fill the financing gap, including for the nature restoration law. So some of these calculations need to enter into the public debate. So do we have a question in the room? Please go ahead. Just hang on a sec, the microphone is coming. And remind us who you are.
I am Angela Kedaitini. I worked for European Commission. Now we have our own platform, Club Climate Europe, and I wanted to ask you two questions. One, nature-based solutions, where they integrate here, because there are many Horizon projects on nature-based solutions as a part of nature restoration law. And the second question, how much implementation of nature restoration law and all of this biodiversity add towards 2050 goal of carbon neutral Europe? How much percent, for example?
Thank you. Could you pass the microphone just behind you? I'll take a couple of questions. And come back.
I work in Italian grid operator, which we have some question related to our infrastructure projects, because in this nature regulation, nature restoration law is not mentioned any relationship between energy projects or the grid projects with the nature restoration. So before plan or construct any project, we do already some feasibility study, which includes also the study of nature and the possibility to construct any project on this territory. So our worries is if nature restoration law can have some negative effect on our projects, and if we will be obliged to do another additional feasibility study related this regulation law, and if it can be delay or our project implementation and authorization process of our projects, because for now it's not mentioned, the grid operators is not mentioned. So we don't understand actually what kind of relationship nature restoration law has with energy operators and grid operators. And it's also important for us to participate in some working groups in order to express our position on it.
Okay, thank you. And we'll take one more so that then you can decide what you'd like to answer. Just over here, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Andras Kroll from TNC, the Nature Conservancy. And two short technical questions. One is that we talk a lot about cost, but remembering the EU impact assessment study, when it says that €1 invested in nature restoration yields, I believe, €8, maybe even more. I haven't heard about it yet. Like, actually, it's a positive sum game. So there's also finances generated. Where is this money? How is this money going to be used, reinvested? And the other question, maybe I should read the report in detail, but I wonder, when you look at the cost, you look at the cost of the restoration only, or also the maintenance of the restored land? Because these two things are maybe not similar or identical. Thank you.
I'll kick off with the technical questions, and then my colleagues can take over for the other ones. So maybe starting with the cost versus benefit. Indeed, from the impact assessment, it followed that there are certainly costs, but the benefits are much greater, right? But this does relate with the various ecosystem services that come with restoring nature, and carbon sequestration is one of which you can model in a way that we did. The other ecosystem services, such as climate change adaptation, water filtration, even like the intrinsic value that nature gives to it, all these others are much harder to model. And therefore we weren't able to model in this way, but they're definitely there. And if you do it on the way that the impact assessment did, indeed, €1 in is, let's say, €8 out. But many of those euros that come out are public goods, right? Clean air, climate adaptation is very hard. If you invest in 1 hectare of nature restoration, you won't necessarily see all those monetary returns. So that's where the differences come from. Well, they do certainly exist on a societal level, but it's also where the modeling that Dirk Fraser mentioned.
It's a strong case for society investing in
Yeah.
it. So that makes
Yeah.
exactly the case for society raising taxes and paying for it.
I agree. And your second question was on?
The cost of restoring the site and the cost of maintaining.
Yeah. So we include one of restoration costs at the beginning, and then annual maintenance costs. So we include both. It's the I think for the full period of the implementation law. So up until either 2050 or we take 20 years more. It's in the paper, but we take both.
Thank you, and thank you also for highlighting the effect that €1 spent on restoration has overall. And it is kind of a shame that it is not in a check return to government that can be then reinvested, but it's more like a public good that everyone expect to be there for granted. So I think we should not get tired to point that out. So thank you for that. With regard to nature-based solution projects that are already implemented or being implemented or in the planning, they all can contribute and do contribute to nature restoration, and they can be counted or accounted towards the nature restoration goals and mentioned as measures under the national restoration plans if the effect has not presented itself in full. So if the project is done and final, then they should not be included, but they already had their effect on nature. But if the effect is still ongoing or the implementation is not started yet, then of course they can be mentioned. And you asked about the precise percentage of how much the nature restoration law contributes to achieving the climate goals, the long-term climate goals. I'm afraid I cannot provide a specific number. Maybe you can help out. But with regard to the LULUCF sector, it is of the utmost importance because resilient and functional ecosystems are a prerequisite for achieving the LULUCF goals. And if we look closely at the targets that are stated within the nature restoration law, we see that almost all of the targets have immediate or direct connection to climate goals, climate adaptation, and climate mitigation, climate change mitigation. Except for maybe pollinators, which have not an immediate but a kind of mediate effect on climate as well. So it is absolutely important to move forward with regard to the LULUCF targets. And maybe one quick answer to your question with regard to projects and renewable energy. We do have in the nature restoration law a clause that allows for those projects to move forward if within the member state this has been put in place. It's Article 6 of the nature restoration law, and also within the article relevant for all the ecosystems, we have specific provisions regarding plans of utmost importance for the member state, which can also consist of renewable energy plans. So there are provisions in place that put privileges on renewable energy projects. In this case, you may want to look into these to see what in your case is applicable.
Okay, we are going to have to call it a day because it's 2 o'clock and we have to finish here. But thank you all for a really interesting debate about this paper. Thank you for joining us. I mentioned at the beginning there are 2 papers out on the Bruegel website, one on the nature restoration law and the other one on nature credits. And we look forward to seeing you after the summer. I hope we will be able to do an event specifically on nature markets as we move forward. And thank you very much for your interest.